March 6, 1944, 11:30 in the morning, 30,000 feet above the German Reich. A formation of 730 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched across the frozen sky like a river of silver, their contrails painting white ribbons against the pale blue canvas of the atmosphere. The temperature outside the aircraft was minus 40 degrees Celsius. Ice crystals formed on the windscreens as bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites, squinting through the haze at the distant target below. They were heading toward the most heavily defended city in Nazi Germany, Berlin, the Big B, the heart of the Third Reich. Inside the cockpits of the heavy bombers, young American men, most of them barely 20 years old, gripped their controls with white-knuckled hands. They knew the statistics all too well. They had seen the empty bunks in their barracks, the missing faces at breakfast. On previous deep penetration raids into Germany without fighter escort, 1 in 4 bombers never came home. Some missions had been even worse. The waist gunners scanned the horizon, their breath freezing in the thin air despite their heated suits. Somewhere ahead, hundreds of Luftwaffe Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were scrambling from airfields across Germany, their pilots eager to add another American bomber to their victory tallies. But on this day, something was different. Something had changed the equation entirely. For the first time in the war, sleek silver fighters with distinctive squared-off wingtips were flying alongside the bombers, not just to the German border as before, but all the way to Berlin itself. These were P-51 Mustangs, and their presence over the German capital that morning would mark the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. The German fighter pilots, climbing toward the bomber stream, expected the usual scenario they had exploited for over a year. American escorts would turn back somewhere over the Low Countries, their fuel tanks running dry, leaving the big bombers naked and vulnerable for the final run to the target. It had worked countless times before. The Luftwaffe pilots called this the moment of truth, when they could attack without interference from the little friends. But when the Luftwaffe pilots reached attack altitude and spotted the American formation, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The little friends were still there. They had followed the bombers all the way to Berlin, 600 miles from their bases in England, and they still had enough fuel to fight. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants, would later tell Allied interrogators that when fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. The war in the air, he admitted in defeat, was lost from that moment forward. The Americans had achieved what German strategists believed was impossible. This is the story of how a fighter plane that America almost rejected became the weapon that broke the back of Nazi air power. It is a story of genius engineering and desperate improvisation, of unlikely partnerships between American manufacturing and British innovation. It is a story of bureaucratic blindness, overcome by combat necessity. Most of all, it is a story of the young men who climbed into those cockpits day after day, knowing that each mission might be their last, and how their courage changed the course of the Second World War. The P-51 Mustang was never supposed to exist. In the spring of 1940, as Nazi Germany was conquering Western Europe with terrifying speed, France was falling, and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. A delegation from the British Purchasing Commission arrived in Los Angeles with an unusual request. Britain was desperate for fighter planes. The Royal Air Force had lost hundreds of aircraft in the disastrous campaign in France, and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. Every Spitfire and Hurricane was needed for home defense. The British needed every additional fighter they could get their hands on from America. The delegation approached North American Aviation, a company headquartered in Los Angeles that had never built a fighter plane in its entire history. North American was known for building training aircraft like the AT-6 Texan, which trained more Allied pilots than any other aircraft, and the B-25 Mitchell bomber, which would later become famous for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. They had no experience with high-performance single-engine combat fighters, and the American military had never asked them to design one. The British wanted North American to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license for the Royal Air Force. It was a simple enough request. The P-40 was a decent fighter, already in production in Buffalo, New York, and the British needed it quickly. Building an existing design would be faster than starting from scratch. It seemed like a reasonable solution. But James Howard Kindleberger, the president of North American Aviation, and his chief designer Edgar Schmude had a different idea. They believed they could design and build a better fighter from scratch, incorporating the latest aerodynamic knowledge, and they believed they could do it faster than anyone thought possible. It was an audacious claim from a company with no fighter experience, and the British delegation was understandably skeptical. But Britain was desperate, and desperate times called for unconventional solutions. The British agreed to give North America a chance, but with one demanding condition. The company had to deliver a flying prototype within 120 days. It was an almost impossible deadline by any standard of aircraft development. Most fighter aircraft took years to progress from initial concept to first flight. The prototype stage alone typically required 8 months to a year. North American was promising to do it in 4 months. Work began officially on May 1, 1940. Edgar Schmude, an Austrian-born engineer who had fled Europe before the Nazi rise to power and become an American citizen, led a team of designers who worked around the clock in the Los Angeles factory. They poured 78,000 man-hours into the design in just over 3 months, working double and triple shifts, sleeping on cots in the factory when necessary. Schmude was a meticulous engineer with an eye for aerodynamic efficiency. He incorporated cutting-edge innovations that other American manufacturers had ignored or deemed too risky to implement. He designed a laminar flow wing in cooperation with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the precursor to NASA. This wing profile reduced drag to levels never before achieved in a single-engine fighter aircraft. At certain speed ranges, the laminar flow wing produced 30% less drag than conventional airfoil designs. Schmude positioned the radiator cooling system at the rear of the fuselage in a distinctive belly scoop arrangement that exploited the Meredith effect. As hot air exited through the duct at the rear, it produced a slight jet thrust that partially offset the drag created by the cooling system. The fuselage itself was designed using mathematically lofted conic sections, producing smooth, uninterrupted surfaces that minimized parasitic drag. The result was an aircraft that could slip through the air with remarkable efficiency. On September 9, 1940, the prototype rolled out of the factory at Mines Field, which would later become Los Angeles International Airport. From the firm production order on May 29 to rollout was just 102 days, an almost miraculous achievement in aircraft development. The aircraft was designated NA-73X, following North American's internal numbering system. It emerged without an engine installed, and with wheels borrowed from a training aircraft because the production landing gear had not yet arrived, but the airframe was complete and ready for testing. The Allison V 1710 engine was installed over the following weeks, and taxi tests began. Freelance test pilot Vance Breese made the first flight on October 26, 1940. The initial hop lasted just 5 minutes, as Breese carefully evaluated the handling characteristics. A longer 10-minute flight followed later that same day. The aircraft handled beautifully. The control responses were crisp and predictable. The speed and climb performance exceeded all estimates. Tragedy struck on November 20th when Paul Balfour, North American's chief test pilot, crashed the prototype during a high-speed test flight. It was Balfour's first time flying the aircraft, and he had declined designer Edgar Schmude's offer to walk him through the cockpit systems beforehand. Approximately 12 minutes after takeoff, the Allison engine quit when Balfour neglected to switch to another fuel tank. Too far from Mines Field to glide back, he made a forced landing in a ploughed field. The tires dug into soft earth, and the aircraft flipped inverted. Balfour crawled out uninjured. Remarkably, the prototype was rebuilt and flew again the following April. The British were impressed enough by what they had seen to give the fighter a name. They called it the Mustang, after the wild horses of the American plains. But the United States Army Air Corps showed almost no interest in this remarkable new fighter. The aircraft had been designed at British request, with no American military involvement, and the Mustang was treated as a foreign curiosity rather than a strategic asset. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr., a legendary polo player who had become an American military attaché in London, would later describe the institutional resistance bluntly. The Mustang, he wrote, had no parent in the Army Air Corps to appreciate and push its good points. It was, as he put it, sired by the English out of an American mother. The early Mustang had one critical flaw that severely limited its potential as a high-altitude fighter. Its engine, the Allison V 1710-39, was an excellent American power plant at low altitudes, producing around 1,150 horsepower at takeoff. The Allison was reliable, relatively simple to maintain, and produced impressive performance below 15,000 feet. But the Allison used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger with a critical altitude of roughly 14,000 feet. Above that altitude, as the air grew thinner, the supercharger could not force enough air into the engine to maintain power. Performance dropped dramatically exactly where it was needed most, in the thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere where the air war over Europe was being fought. Bomber formations flew at 25,000 feet or higher to avoid light anti-aircraft fire. Luftwaffe interceptors climbed above them to attack from superior altitude. A fighter that could not perform above 15,000 feet was essentially useless for the high-altitude battles that decided the war. The Royal Air Force discovered this limitation quickly after the first Mustang ones arrived in Britain in late 1941. Below 15,000 feet, the Mustang was sensational. It could outrun a Spitfire Mark V at low altitude by 30 miles per hour. It had nearly twice the range of any British fighter. The handling was superb, but above 15,000 feet, where the Spitfire came into its own, the Mustang became sluggish and unresponsive. It could not climb fast enough to intercept high-altitude bombers or engage in the swirling dogfights that characterized combat over Europe. The RAF relegated its Mustangs to tactical reconnaissance and low-level ground attack missions, roles that wasted the airframe's extraordinary aerodynamic potential. The Mustang Mark I became a superb low-level reconnaissance platform, but it was nowhere near reaching its true capabilities as a fighter. For 2 years, the Mustang remained a promising but fundamentally limited aircraft, a thoroughbred hitched to a plow, its potential unrealized. Then, on April 30th, 1942, a 30-minute test flight at RAF Duxford changed everything. Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord of the Air Fighting Development Unit had been evaluating the Mustang I for several months and was impressed by its low-altitude performance. He invited Ronald Harker, a test pilot who worked as a liaison officer for Rolls Royce, to fly the aircraft and give his assessment. Harker was not just any test pilot. He had extensive experience with both British and American fighters and understood engine performance intimately from his work with Rolls Royce. Harker flew the Mustang for approximately 30 minutes that day. He was deeply impressed by the aircraft's performance at low and medium altitudes. The handling was superb, among the best he had ever experienced. The speed was excellent. The cockpit layout was logical and well designed. But above 18,000 feet, the Mustang became sluggish and unresponsive, just like every other report had indicated. The Allison engine simply could not deliver power in the thin air. Shortly after his flight, Harker sat down and wrote a letter to his superiors at Rolls Royce that would change the course of aviation history. In that letter, he made a recommendation that seems obvious in hindsight, but was revolutionary at the time. He suggested that if the Mustang were fitted with a Rolls Royce Merlin 61 engine, the same supercharged engine that powered the latest Spitfires and the Lancaster bomber, its performance should be outstanding. The Merlin had a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger with an intercooler that maintained power at high altitudes. Combined with the Mustang's extremely low-drag airframe, the result could be something truly special. Harker wrote that the Mustang was already 35 miles per hour faster than a Spitfire Mark V at roughly the same engine power. With the Merlin's superior high-altitude performance, the aircraft could become the best fighter in the world. He urged immediate action. Within 48 hours, Rolls-Royce Managing Director Ernest Hives authorized the conversion project to proceed. He telephoned Air Chief Marshal Wilfred Freeman to secure Mustang airframes for the experiment. Freeman, who understood the desperate need for long-range fighters, gave immediate approval. 2 parallel conversion programs began simultaneously, one in Britain using Rolls-Royce facilities, and one in America using Packard-built Merlin engines produced under license in Detroit. Ronald Harker would later be remembered as the man who put the Merlin in the Mustang. His 30-minute test flight and subsequent letter had identified the path to transforming a limited tactical aircraft into the war's greatest fighter. The first British conversion, designated the Mustang X, flew on October 13, 1942. Test pilot Ronald Shepard took it up from the Rolls-Royce facility at Hucknall in Nottinghamshire, and the results were nothing short of electrifying. The Merlin-powered Mustang achieved 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, with an absolute ceiling exceeding 40,000 feet. The transformation was staggering beyond anyone's expectations. The Merlin 65 engine produced around 1,400 horsepower, compared to the Allison's 1,150, but more importantly, it maintained that power at high altitude. At 20,000 feet, the Merlin produced 200 more horsepower than the Allison. At 30,000 feet, the advantage grew to nearly 500 horsepower. The Mustang could now fight where the war was being won and lost. In America, North American Aviation undertook its own conversion program, using the Packard 5 1653, the American license-built version of the Merlin engine. The United States Army Air Forces was so confident in the expected results that it ordered 400 P-51 models before any Merlin-engined Mustang had even flown in America. It was an extraordinary gamble based entirely on British test data and faith in the Mustang airframe. On November 30th, 1942, test pilot Robert Chilton flew the first American Merlin Mustang, designated the XP-51B, at the North American factory in Inglewood, California. He achieved 441 miles per hour at nearly 30,000 feet, with a rate of climb almost double that of the Allison-powered version. The gamble had paid off spectacularly. The Army Air Forces immediately placed orders for thousands more. Engineering the marriage of the Merlin engine and the Mustang airframe required significant modifications. The Merlin weighed approximately 300 pounds more than the Allison, requiring a completely new engine mount and redesigned forward fuselage structure. The cowling was redesigned with a distinctive chin inlet for carburetor air. The two nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns had to be eliminated, with all armament concentrated in the wings. Production was split between North American's original plant in Inglewood, California, which built the P-51B, and a massive new facility in Dallas, Texas, which produced the P-51C. The two letter designations reflected only the factory of origin. The aircraft themselves were mechanically identical. The definitive version, the P-51D, emerged in mid-1944 with improvements that addressed every pilot complaint about the earlier Merlin Mustangs. The razorback fuselage of the B and C models had created a blind spot behind and above the pilot, a potentially fatal deficiency in combat. The D model solved this with a cut-down rear fuselage fitted with a teardrop bubble canopy that gave pilots 360-degree visibility for the first time. Armament increased from 4 to 650 caliber. Browning M, two machine guns mounted upright along the wing, arranged to follow the wing's dihedral angle. This eliminated the chronic jamming problems that had plagued the earlier models, where the guns had been mounted at angles that caused cartridges to misfeed during high-G maneuvers. The K-14 computing gun sight improved gunnery accuracy dramatically. Most importantly, for the strategic bombing campaign, an 85-gallon fuel tank was added behind the pilot's seat, extending range to levels that seemed almost impossible for a single-engine fighter. This tank created dangerous center of gravity problems when full, making the aircraft unstable and difficult to control, but pilots learned to burn it down to 25 gallons before entering combat. With two external drop tanks of 75 or 110 gallons each, the P-51D could fly over 1,600 miles, enough to escort bombers from bases in England to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. No other single-engine fighter in the world approached this capability. The unit cost was equally impressive. At roughly $51,000 per aircraft, the P-51D was the most economical high-performance fighter in the Allied inventory. A P-47 Thunderbolt cost $83,000. A P-38 Lightning cost over $97,000. The Mustang delivered superior performance at barely half the price of its American competitors. By early 1944, the P-51B was reaching operational squadrons in England in significant numbers, and the 8th Air Force was about to put it to the ultimate test over the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany had reached a crisis point that threatened to derail the entire Allied war strategy. American bombing doctrine, developed by theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School during the 1930s, held that heavily armed B-17 and B-24 bombers, flying in tight defensive box formations, could fight their way to any target in daylight without fighter escort. The concentrated firepower of dozens of bombers, each carrying up to 13 machine guns, would create a crossfire that no enemy fighter could survive. This theory had been catastrophically disproven over the skies of Germany. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its most ambitious mission yet, a coordinated attack on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft plant at Regensburg. 376 B-17s took off from English bases that morning in what was intended to be a devastating blow to German war production. The mission was a catastrophe. 60 bombers were shot down, over 17% of the attacking force, with 600 crew members killed or captured. Over 100 additional bombers returned to England with battle damage. On October 14, 1943, a mission that survivors would remember as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s attacked Schweinfurt again in an attempt to finish the job. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters, operating without interference over their homeland, attacked the unescorted bombers in waves that lasted for hours. 60 bombers were shot down over Germany. 17 more were damaged so badly they were written off after crash landing in England. 600 American airmen were killed or missing in a single afternoon. That was a loss rate of 26%. No air force in history had sustained such casualties and continued to function. Deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended entirely after Black Thursday. The existing American fighters simply lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent fighter, rugged enough to absorb tremendous punishment and well armed with 850 caliber guns. But its combat radius was barely 400 miles, not nearly enough to reach Berlin or even Schweinfurt. The P-38 Lightning had longer range but suffered from engine reliability problems in the extreme cold temperatures of high altitude over northern Europe. Its turbo-supercharged Allison engines were prone to malfunction at 30 below zero. Something had to change dramatically, or the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail and the war would be prolonged. The P-51 Mustang arrived at exactly the right moment. On January 6, 1944, General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was already a legend, the man who had led the daring bombing raid on Tokyo in April 1942, launching B-25 bombers from the aircraft carrier Hornet in the first attack on the Japanese home islands. He understood that winning the air war required more than protecting bombers. It required finding and destroying the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. Doolittle ordered a revolution in fighter tactics that changed the entire nature of the air war. At 8th Fighter Command Headquarters under General William Kepner, there was a sign that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle ordered it taken down. In its place, he put a new sign that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." The change was more than symbolic. Instead of flying close escort, tethered to the bomber formations where they could only react to German attacks, Mustang pilots were now ordered to range far ahead of the bombers. Fighter groups would sweep 50 miles in front of the bomber stream in 25-mile-wide patterns, hunting for Luftwaffe formations as they assembled over their airfields or climbed to attack altitude. The bombers became bait to lure German fighters into the air. The Mustangs became the weapon to destroy them. Doolittle added another controversial instruction. After their escort duties were complete, fighter pilots were authorized to descend and strafe German airfields, rail yards, and anything else of military value. This ground attack mission was extremely dangerous. More Mustang pilots would be killed by anti-aircraft fire during strafing runs than in air-to-air combat. But it multiplied the pressure on the Luftwaffe, destroying aircraft on the ground and forcing Germany to deploy scarce anti-aircraft guns to defend airfields. Only the P-51 had the range to execute this aggressive strategy over Berlin. And in early March 1944, the Mustangs went to Berlin for the first time. The 4th Fighter Group, under Colonel Don Blakesley, had received their P-51B models only on February 28th, giving pilots barely a week to familiarize themselves with the new aircraft before flying it into combat over the German capital. Some pilots flew to Berlin with less than 1 hour of experience in the Mustang. The transition from their familiar P-47 Thunderbolts required rapid adaptation to a lighter, faster aircraft with completely different handling characteristics. On March 3, 1944, the first Berlin mission launched from English airfields, but heavy weather scattered the bomber formations, and the mission was recalled before reaching the target. The 4th Fighter Group engaged approximately 60 Luftwaffe fighters near the German town of Wittenberg, claiming 5 kills but losing 3 pilots. It was an inauspicious beginning. On March 4th, weather conditions were even worse. Only about 30 B-17s from a force of hundreds managed to reach the Berlin area through impenetrable cloud cover. 8 pilots from the 4th Fighter Group, including the rising stars Don Gentile and Johnny Godfrey, pressed on toward Berlin with the small bomber force. Over the German capital, they encountered roughly 60 enemy fighters. The 8 P-51s shot down 8 German aircraft in a furious engagement over the city. 4 Mustangs were lost. But this small group of American fighters had accomplished something unprecedented. They had completed the approximately 1,100-mile round trip to Berlin and back, engaging the enemy over his own capital. It had never been done before by single-engine fighters. Then came March 6, 1944, the day that would be remembered as the largest and most significant air battle of the war. 730 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers flew against Berlin in 3 massive formations, escorted by over 800 fighters in relay. 563 P-47 Thunderbolts flew the initial escort, their limited range restricting them to the route over the North Sea and the Low Countries. 121 P-51 Mustangs took over for the deep penetration phase. P-38 Lightnings filled gaps where they were available. The 357th Fighter Group, which had been operational for barely 3 weeks with their new P-51B aircraft, launched 48 Mustangs that morning. Their pilots, many of them fresh from training, were about to face the full strength of the German fighter defense over its most important city. Approximately 1,626 tons of bombs fell on Berlin that day, striking aircraft factories, rail facilities, and the Erkner ball-bearing plant on the city's eastern outskirts. The cost to the American formations was severe. 69 heavy bombers were shot down, a 9.5% loss rate that approached the unsustainable levels of Black Thursday. 11 fighters were lost. Over 600 American airmen were killed or listed as missing that single day. The 100th Bomb Group alone lost 15 of its aircraft, reinforcing its grim nickname among the other groups, the Bloody 100th. But the Luftwaffe paid even more dearly. Between 80 and 160 German fighters were destroyed on March 6th, with Mustang escorts accounting for 35 of those kills over Berlin itself. The numbers told only part of the story. Unlike the Americans, Germany could not replace its experienced combat pilots. The training pipeline that produced seasoned fighter aces required years to develop a skilled pilot. The 8th Air Force destroyed twice as many enemy aircraft in March 1944 alone as it had shot down in the previous 2 years combined. The shock among German pilots was profound. General Adolf Galland, who held the title of General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe and was responsible for the Reich's air defense, later wrote that when the first reports of long-range American fighters over Germany reached Reichsmarschall Goering's headquarters, they were officially denied as impossible. The Luftwaffe High Command simply refused to believe that single-engine fighters could fly from England to Berlin. Galland decided to investigate personally. He and fellow Luftwaffe General Hannes Trautloft took off in their Focke-Wulf 190s to see for themselves what was happening over the Reich. American Mustangs found them. Both German generals narrowly escaped being shot down. Galland survived by firing his forward guns, which produced trailing smoke and spent casings that gave pursuing P-51 pilots the impression his aircraft had been hit. The American pilots broke off their attack, allowing Galland to disengage. German fighter pilot Fritz Engau of Fighter Wing 11 recalled the terrifying reality of mid-1944. "The Mustangs," he said, circled over almost every crossroads, junction and railway station in Germany. They flew in pairs at low altitude to catch aircraft taking off or landing, with other pairs covering them from high above. There was no escape from their presence. The attrition statistics tell the story of the Luftwaffe's destruction more clearly than any narrative. During Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week, from February 20th to February 25th, 1944, 17% of Germany's experienced fighter pilots were killed in just 6 days. Nearly 100 irreplaceable men who had trained for years and survived dozens of combat missions were gone in less than a week. The Luftwaffe wrote off 34% of its fighter strength in January 1944. In February, the figure rose to 56%. Although Albert Speer's industrial dispersal programs actually increased German aircraft production through late 1944, trained pilots could not be manufactured in factories. Aviation fuel supplies collapsed from 180,000 tons in April 1944 to just 10,000 tons by August. New fighters sat idle for lack of both pilots and fuel. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air supremacy was total and unchallenged. When General Eisenhower's son, a young lieutenant serving on his father's staff, pointed out that vehicles moving bumper to bumper from the Normandy landing craft violated every textbook principle about presenting concentrated targets to enemy aircraft, Eisenhower replied simply that if he did not have air supremacy, he would not be standing there at all. The invasion of Normandy was made possible because the Luftwaffe could not interfere. The once mighty German Air Force could barely muster between 200 and 400 serviceable fighters in all of France to oppose the Allied landings. During June 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 931 aircraft in combat. By the end of that month, only 425 German fighters remained operational in the entire Western European theatre. The men who flew the Mustangs were as remarkable as the aircraft themselves. Their courage and skill transformed a technological advantage into total victory. Major George Preddy Jr. became the highest-scoring Mustang ace of the entire war, with 26.83 officially credited aerial victories. Born in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1919, Preddy had been rejected 3 times by the United States Navy before finally gaining acceptance to Army Air Force's flight training. He arrived in England in late 1943 and joined the 352nd Fighter Group, known throughout the 8th Air Force as the Blue Noses for the distinctive paint on their aircraft. Preddy named his personal Mustang Cripes a Mighty, an exclamation he used frequently in conversation. On August 6, 1944, he achieved one of the most spectacular individual performances of the entire air war. While escorting bombers near Hamburg, Preddy spotted a large formation of Messerschmitt 109s climbing to attack the bomber stream. He dove to intercept. In less than 6 minutes of furious combat, George Preddy shot down 6 enemy fighters, an almost unprecedented achievement. For his extraordinary performance that day, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration for valor. Preddy's death came under circumstances that still haunt aviation historians. On Christmas Day, 1944, during the desperate Battle of the Bulge, American ground troops were struggling to contain the German offensive through the Ardennes forest. Preddy was leading a flight of Mustangs, providing close support when he spotted a Fokker-Wulf 190 at treetop level, heading toward American positions. He dove to pursue. An American Army anti-aircraft battery on the ground, unable to identify the low-flying aircraft in the confusion of battle, opened fire on both planes. Preddy's Mustang was struck by 50 caliber rounds from the American guns. His aircraft crashed in flames near the Belgian town of Liège. George Preddy was 25 years old. In a tragedy that compounded the loss, his younger brother William, also a P-51 pilot serving in another fighter group, was killed by enemy anti-aircraft fire just 4 months later. Both Preddy brothers are buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in France, their graves among more than 10,000 Americans who gave their lives in the liberation of Europe. Colonel John C. Meyer, who flew alongside George Preddy in the 352nd Fighter Group and accumulated 24 aerial victories of his own, offered a tribute to his fallen comrade that has endured through the decades. George Preddy, he said, was the greatest fighter pilot who ever squinted through a gun sight. Captain Dominic Salvatore Gentile, known throughout the 8th Air Force as Don Gentile and celebrated in the American press as the Ace of Aces, scored 19.83, confirmed aerial victories with American forces, plus 2 additional kills with the RAF, before the United States entered the war. His path to the cockpit followed an unconventional route that reflected his determination to fly in combat. Born in Piqua, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, Gentile had been rejected by the United States Army Air Forces because he lacked the required 2 years of college education. Undeterred, he contacted the Clayton Knight Committee, a semi-official Canadian and British recruitment organization that channeled American volunteers into the Royal Canadian Air Force. In August 1941, his father drove him to the RCAF recruiting office in Windsor, Ontario, where he enlisted. After earning his wings, Gentile was posted to the United Kingdom and assigned to No. 133 Eagle Squadron, one of 3 squadrons composed of American volunteer pilots serving with the RAF before Pearl Harbor. After America entered the war, the Eagle squadrons were transferred to American control, and Gentile joined the 4th Fighter Group. His partnership with his regular wingman John Godfrey became legendary throughout the 8th Air Force. The 2 pilots flew together constantly, covering each other's blind spots and coordinating their attacks with an almost telepathic understanding. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself called them Damon and Pythias, after the legendary friends of ancient Greek tradition who would sacrifice anything for each other. On April 5, 1944, Don Gentile surpassed the victory record of Eddie Rickenbacker, America's top ace from the First World War, when counting both aerial and ground kills. The American press celebrated him as the greatest fighter pilot in American history. His combat career ended just 8 days later in circumstances that were more embarrassing than heroic. With assembled press photographers and newsreel cameras watching at the 4th Fighter Group's base at Debden in Essex, Gentile decided to celebrate his achievements with a low-level aerobatic display. He brought his Mustang, named Shangri-La after the mythical paradise, down to grass-cutting height over the airfield. He misjudged his altitude by inches. The aircraft clipped a slight rise in the ground and cartwheeled into a spectacular crash. Gentile emerged from the wreckage uninjured, but his beloved Mustang was destroyed. Colonel Don Blakesley, the 4th Fighter Group's hard-nosed commander, had a standing rule. Anyone who damaged their aircraft through reckless flying was sent home immediately, regardless of their combat record. Gentile's war was over. He returned to the United States and spent the rest of the conflict training other pilots. Captain Charles Elwood Yeager, known to everyone as Chuck Yeager, flew with the 357th Fighter Group and scored 11.5 aerial victories. He would later achieve immortality as the first human being to fly faster than the speed of sound, breaking the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 rocket plane on October 14, 1947. But before that historic flight, Yeager proved himself in the lethal skies over Germany. Shot down over occupied France on March 5, 1944, during only his 8th combat mission, Yeager evaded capture with help from the French resistance. He spent weeks hiding in barns and crossing the Pyrenees Mountains on foot into Spain. After returning to England, he personally appealed to General Eisenhower for permission to resume combat flying. This request was highly unusual. Standard policy prohibited downed pilots who had been helped by resistance networks from returning to combat over occupied territory. If captured, they might reveal information about the resistance fighters who had aided them, but Yeager argued his case forcefully, and Eisenhower, impressed by his determination, granted the exception. On October 12, 1944, Chuck Yeager became an ace in a day. Leading a patrol near Steinhuder Lake in northern Germany, he spotted a large formation of 22 Messerschmitt 109s below him. Without hesitation, he pushed over into a dive from 28,000 feet and tore into the enemy formation alone. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Yeager destroyed 5 German fighters in rapid succession. Remarkably, 2 of his kills came without firing a shot. The panicking German pilots, trying desperately to evade his attacks, collided with each other in mid-air. Both pilots managed to bail out successfully, but their aircraft were destroyed. Yeager was also among the first American pilots to shoot down a Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, catching one of the revolutionary aircraft on its landing approach at low speed on November 6, 1944. The jets could outrun any piston-engine fighter in level flight, but during takeoff and landing, when their engines were throttled back, they were vulnerable. The Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group represented one of the most significant chapters in American military history. They were the first African-American military aviators in United States history, trained at the segregated Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, despite widespread prejudice and institutional barriers. Of 992 pilots trained at Tuskegee, approximately 355 deployed overseas for combat operations. The group transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in July 1944 and painted their aircraft tails red, earning them the nickname Red Tails throughout the 15th Air Force. Their escort record was exceptional by any standard. On only 7 of 179 bomber escort missions did the 332nd lose any escorted bombers to enemy fighters. Just 27 total bombers were lost on their watch, significantly fewer than the average for other 15th Air Force P-51 groups flying similar missions. Bomber crews specifically requested red tail escorts because of their reputation for staying with the bombers. On March 24, 1945, led by Colonel Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., the son of the first black general in the United States Army, the Red Tails escorted bombers on the 15th Air Force's longest mission of the entire war. It was a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin, a grueling flight that pushed the Mustang's range to its absolute limits. Over the German capital, they engaged and shot down 3 Messerschmitt Tu-62 jet fighters, earning a distinguished unit citation for their performance. First, Lieutenant Lee Archer, with 5 confirmed aerial victories, including 3 Messerschmitt 109s destroyed in 10 minutes during a single engagement over Lake Balaton in Hungary, is recognized as the Red Tails' leading ace. He would go on to serve for 29 years, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1970. The P-51 Mustang proved to be the most effective Allied answer to the Messerschmitt Tu-62, Germany's revolutionary jet fighter. At speeds exceeding 530 miles per hour, the Tu-62 could outrun any piston engine fighter in level flight. But its Junkers turbojets were slow to accelerate, leaving the aircraft defenseless during takeoff and landing. Mustang pilots exploited this weakness ruthlessly. On February 25, 1945, pilots from the 55th Fighter Group caught an entire squadron of Messerschmitt Tu-62s taking off from their airfield. Diving on the slow-moving jets, the Mustang pilots destroyed 6 before they could accelerate. Overall, P-51s claimed approximately 93 aerial victories against the German jets, more than any other Allied fighter type. Beyond their escort duties, Mustangs conducted devastating ground attack campaigns that crippled German logistics and transportation. Through Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo, beginning on May 21, 1944, 8th Air Force fighters systematically destroyed the French and German railway networks that supplied the German army. In its first 2 weeks of operations, approximately 500 fighters destroyed 475 locomotives and cut the French rail system at 150 strategic points. German supplies intended for the Normandy front piled up at railheads far from the battle, unable to move forward. By the end of the war, 14 of 15 8th Air Force fighter groups flew P-51 Mustangs. The single holdout, the 56th Fighter Group, chose to keep their beloved P-47 Thunderbolts. The combat statistics of the Mustang reveal both the aircraft's dominance and the immense scale of the air war it helped win. Total production reached approximately 15,586 aircraft across all variants, with the P-51D accounting for over 8,000 units, more than all other variants combined. In the European theatre of operations, Mustangs claimed approximately 4,950 aerial victories, representing roughly half of all Army Air Force's aerial claims in Europe. An additional 4,131 enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks. The combined total of nearly 9,000 aircraft destroyed represents a devastating blow to German air power that contributed directly to the Allied victory. Combat losses totaled approximately 2,520 P-51s in Europe, from all causes, including anti-aircraft fire, accidents, and mechanical failure. In strictly air-to-air combat, where Mustangs were lost to enemy fighters rather than ground fire, the kill ratio was exceptionally high. More than 250 pilots achieved ace status flying Mustangs, more than any other American fighter type. The Mustang's decisive advantage was range. Its laminar flow wing gave it the lowest drag coefficient of any World War II fighter. Combined with 269 gallons of internal fuel and 2 external drop tanks of up to 110 gallons each, its combat radius exceeded 750 miles, enough to fly from England to Berlin and back, with fuel remaining for combat. No other single-engine fighter came close to matching this capability. The P-51 service did not end with victory in Europe. Redesignated the F-51 in 1948, it was rushed back into combat when the Korean War erupted in June 1950. Approximately 145 F-51D aircraft flew close air support missions for American and Allied forces until jet aircraft could take over the role. In civilian hands after the war, the Mustang became the undisputed champion of air racing, dominating the unlimited class at the National Championship air races in Reno, Nevada, from 1964 until the races at that location ended in 2023. The races have since relocated to Roswell, New Mexico. Modified racers achieved speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, far faster than any wartime Mustang ever flew. Of the roughly 15,000 Mustangs manufactured during the war, approximately 150 remain airworthy today. A flyable P-51 now commands prices starting at $2 million. Museums from the Smithsonian to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford display Mustangs as centerpieces of their aviation collections. The story of the P-51 Mustang is ultimately a story about how the right airframe met the right engine at precisely the right moment in history. Edgar Schmude's aerodynamically brilliant design had languished for 2 years with an inadequate power plant, its extraordinary potential unrealized, its future uncertain. Ronald Harker's 30-minute test flight at Duxford and his letter to Rolls Royce unlocked capabilities that the original designers could only have dreamed of achieving. But technology alone did not win the air war over Europe. It was the pilots who climbed into those cockpits day after day, knowing that each mission might be their last, who transformed a remarkable machine into a war-winning weapon. Men like George Preddy, who shot down 6 enemy fighters in 6 minutes of furious combat, Don Gentile, who refused to let a missing college degree stop him from becoming an ace, Chuck Yeager, who escaped from occupied France and talked his way back into combat, the Tuskegee Airmen, who overcame hatred and prejudice to prove their worth in the skies over Berlin. These men were fathers and sons, brothers and husbands. Many of them never came home. They rest today in military cemeteries across Europe, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes to the rolling plains of Germany. They were ready to fight and sacrifice for their country, and they did exactly that. The P-51 Mustang did not merely win air superiority over Europe. It destroyed the Luftwaffe completely, eliminating not just aircraft but the irreplaceable, experienced pilots who flew them. It made D-Day possible by ensuring that Allied troops would land on beaches swept clean of German air power. It protected the bombers that devastated German industry and made the final ground campaign achievable. Without the Mustang, the war would have lasted longer and cost many more lives. When Hermann Goering told his Allied interrogators after the war that the long-range escort fighter was the capability Germany never anticipated and could not counter, he was acknowledging a truth that every German pilot had already learned in the deadly skies over the Reich. The Mustang had changed everything. Today, when the distinctive rumble of a Merlin engine fills the air at an air show, when a polished silver Mustang banks against a summer sky, we are hearing an echo of that transformation. We are honoring the memory of the young men who flew those aircraft into history. The P-51 Mustang began its existence as a rejected prototype, built by a company with no fighter experience, for a foreign air force that had nowhere else to turn. It ended the war as the aircraft that Hermann Goering himself admitted had defeated him. That journey from rejection to triumph is one of the great stories of the Second World War. The pilots who survived the war are nearly all gone now, but the aircraft they flew still thunder across American skies, maintained by collectors and museums who understand what they represent. They are not merely machines. They are monuments to a generation that saved the world from tyranny. Every year, at air shows across America and Europe, crowds gather to watch P-51 Mustangs perform. Children point at the sky as the silver fighters bank overhead. Veterans salute as the Merlin engines roar past. And somewhere in that sound, in that moment of connection between past and present, the story continues. The story of America's rejected fighter that became the most feared aircraft over Berlin,